Ma'am, where exactly did you find this? The security guard's voice cracked in the middle of his own question. His hands trembled as he stared down at the black leather bag sitting on the polished marble counter of Zenith National Bank. $30 million. Not 30,000. Not 300,000. $30 million. In tight, banded bricks of foreign currency, stacked so densely the zipper had refused to close all the way. Behind the counter, 3 tellers had frozen mid-transaction. A customer holding a deposit slip forgot he was even in line. Somewhere in the back, a phone rang, and nobody moved to answer it. And standing in front of all of them, soaking wet from the rain, wearing a faded blue dress 2 sizes too big and shoes with a hole cut into the side to make room for a swollen toe, was a woman named Amara Okonkwo. A widow. A mother. A woman who had exactly 4 naira and 11 kobo in her pocket. A 7-year-old daughter at home burning with fever, and an eviction notice folded against her chest like a second heart. She had every reason on earth to keep that bag. Every single reason. Rent overdue. Medicine unaffordable. A landlord threatening to throw her belongings into the street by sundown, and on the sidewalk outside, not a single soul had seen her pick it up. No camera, no witness, no screaming owner running back. For 11 full seconds, Amara had stood over that bag alone, with the entire rest of her life waiting on which way her hand moved next. And still, she zipped it shut. And still, she walked through those glass doors. And still, dripping rainwater onto a marble floor that had never known feet like hers, she pushed $30 million across the counter and said the 6 words that would burn her name into the history of an entire nation. This does not belong to me. The bank manager was called, then the branch director, then the regional director, then a man in a black suit nobody recognized, who arrived in a car with tinted windows and stared at Amara for a long moment without blinking, as if trying to memorize her face. Because somewhere, in a glass tower 14 miles across the city, another man had just discovered his bag was missing. And that man had never planned for honesty. If this story is already gripping you, subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me which country you're joining from. I read every single one. Let us continue. Amara gave her name, her national ID, her home address, whispered so quietly the manager had to ask her to repeat it twice. She signed 4 documents she did not fully understand, printed on paper thicker than any paper she owned. The branch director, a nervous man named Chukwuma Eze, promised her a reward would be arranged the moment the rightful owner was located. He said the words the way a man says words he is not certain he can keep. She thanked him politely. She did not ask when. She did not ask how much. She simply nodded, turned toward the glass doors, and walked back into the rain without an umbrella. Because the 6 naira she had once saved for taxi fare had gone that morning to a small brown bottle of cough syrup for her daughter, Ada. Her home was 1 room behind a tailor's shop in the eastern quarter of the city, rented from a landlord who raised the price every rainy season and inspected the walls for cracks he could blame on her. Ada was 7, small for her age, thin in the wrists, propped up on a pillow that had lost most of its stuffing to years of use. Her cough had started 3 weeks earlier as a soft rattle and grown into something that shook her whole chest at night. "Mama, you are all wet," Ada said, blinking up at her mother in the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. Amara laughed, because if she had cried, she was not certain she would have been able to stop. "The rain likes me today," she said. "It followed me all the way home." That night, Lying on the thin mattress beside her sleeping daughter, Amara did the arithmetic of survival by the light of the lamp. Rent, 3 days late. Medicine, nearly empty. Food, half a bag of rice, 1 onion, a small bundle of dried fish wrapped in newspaper. Money, 4 naira, 11 kobo, tucked inside a sock beneath the mattress. She thought about the black bag exactly once, just once. And she told herself firmly, in the same voice her late husband had once used when teaching Ada to speak the truth even when it stung. It was never yours to keep, Amara. Not one single note. She closed her eyes. She did not yet know that, 14 miles across the city, a man in a tailored charcoal suit was already staring at a phone that would not stop ringing. Staring the way a man stares at a snake curled inside his own shoe. His name was Kwame Adeyemi, 49 years old, property developer, owner of 6 residential towers rising across the eastern half of the city, each one carrying his name on the sign out front in polished brass letters 2 feet high. To the newspapers, Kwame was a self-made success story. A boy from a village of red dust who had risen through concrete and ambition to build the skyline of a nation. To his wife, Neka, he was a man who had not smiled at dinner in 6 months. To his 12-year-old son, Toby, he was a father who left before sunrise and returned after bedtime. And to a handful of very quiet men in very quiet offices around the city, Kwame Adeyemi was a client who paid in cash and did not ask questions. 20 years earlier, Kwame had mixed cement by hand on other men's job sites, sleeping 4 to a rented room, promising himself that one day, no man on earth would ever again tell him when to eat, when to sleep, or when to stop working. That promise had once built something real. His first small block of apartments, honestly poured, honestly sold, honestly proud. Somewhere along the way, honest had become slow. Slow had become expensive. Expensive had become impossible. And Kwame had learned, quietly, at first from other men and later from himself, that a signature from the right building inspector could save more money than 100 hours of proper steel reinforcement. He told himself each time that it was only this once, only this building, only until he was secure enough to do it properly again. Security, it turned out, was a horizon that kept walking away from him no matter how fast he ran toward it. By the time his personal assistant, a sharp young woman named Zainab Musa, had been hired fresh from university, Kwame had already stopped noticing which parts of his empire were still honest and which had quietly rotted underneath, the way a man stops smelling the rot of a room he has lived in too long. The bag Amara had found outside Zenith National Bank had never been meant to enter that bank. It had been meant to leave the country. $30 million, wrapped in 3 false company names, on its way to an account in a small island nation where questions cost extra. Payment for the silence of a senior municipal inspector named Ibrahim Yusuf, who had climbed 1 week earlier onto the unfinished top floor of Kwame's newest tower and photographed something that should not have been there. Or rather, something that should have been there and wasn't. Steel, rebar, structural reinforcement. Ibrahim's photographs, buried at that moment inside a locked drawer in his municipal office, showed foundations poured for 4 occupied residential towers that had no proper skeleton beneath them. Buildings meant to hold 300 families each were standing on concrete built to pass paperwork, not to hold weight. Kwame's driver, a man named Mecca, had been carrying the bag from Kwame's private safe to a waiting private plane when he had stopped, briefly, in the rain, to answer a phone call from Kwame himself, demanding a change of destination. He had set the bag against the wall of Zenith National Bank to shield it from the water while he spoke. When he had looked down again, 40 seconds later, the bag was gone. Emeka had lied. He had told Kwame the bag had been snatched by armed men. He had told Kwame he had chased them and lost them. He had told Kwame anything except the truth, which was that he had set $30 million on a sidewalk and looked away. And so, when Kwame's assistant Zainab burst into his corner office 2 hours later, face drained of color, and whispered, "They found it. A woman turned it in. All of it," Kwame did not celebrate. He should have. Instead, he set his glass down very carefully on the polished desk and said the sentence Zainab would remember every single day for the rest of her life. That money was never supposed to exist in the first place. The next morning, Amara woke to knocking. Not the landlord's knock, which was always short, sharp, and impatient, like a man who had already decided to be unpleasant. This knock was slow, deliberate, almost polite. 3 even taps, then silence, then 3 again. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and cracked open the door. A man stood in her narrow doorway in an expensive charcoal suit, holding a slim leather folder, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Okonkwo?" he said. His voice was smooth, patient, rehearsed. "My name is Kwame Adeyemi. I believe you found something of mine yesterday." Amara's stomach dropped, not from fear of the man himself, but from confusion. The bank had told her the owner's identity was still being verified. It had been less than 24 hours, and yet here he was, on her doorstep, already knowing her name, her address, and the exact hour her 7-year-old daughter would be home alone with her between market shifts. "The bank said it would take time," she said carefully, stepping just far enough into the doorway to block his view of Ada, who was watching from the mattress inside. "I have friends who move faster than paperwork," Kwame said. His smile did not move. "I have come to thank you and to make sure you understand just how grateful I truly am." He opened the folder. Inside was a single crisp document and a heavy silver pen. "A reward," he said. 150,000 naira. All you have to do is sign here, confirming for the bank's records that when you brought in the bag yesterday, it was already empty. That there was no cash inside when you found it. Amara did not reach for the pen. Her eyes traveled slowly from the document up to his face, and something cold settled inside her chest. Not the cold of confusion, the cold of understanding a truth too large to speak aloud. "Why would I say the money was not there?" she asked quietly, "when it was?" Kwame's smile finally faltered, just for a second, just long enough for her to see the man underneath it. "Because," he said, lowering his voice so the neighbors would not hear, leaning slightly closer. "Sometimes the truth is more dangerous to hold on to than it looks. And 150,000 naira could change your daughter's whole life. Would you not rather she be healthy than proud?" From the room behind Amara, right on cue, as if summoned by the mention of her, Ada coughed. A wet, broken sound. Amara felt her resolve crack for exactly 1 heartbeat. The same crack she had felt standing over that black bag outside the bank, when the entire world had narrowed to her daughter's small, tired lungs. She looked at the folder. She looked at the man. And then she said the words that would set every single thing after this into motion. Get off my step, sir, and take your paper with you. Kwame straightened his jacket slowly. On the surface, unbothered. But Amara saw his knuckles go white around the edge of the folder. You do not understand what you have just refused, he said, his voice low now, no longer warm. This is not the end of this conversation. Not even close. He turned. He walked to a black car waiting at the curb. A driver opened the door without needing to be told. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering already, because a car like that had never once been seen on this street. And news like that would spread faster than any newspaper. Amara closed the door. She slid the bolt across. She leaned her back against the wood and slowly slid down until she was sitting on the cold cement floor, her heart hammering. She had just refused money that could cure her daughter, pay her rent for 2 years, and lift her family out of a room behind a tailor's shop where the roof leaked in 3 separate places. And she did not yet know what refusing it was going to cost her. 3 streets away, at a corner tea stall, 2 men who worked for Kwame Adeyemi sat watching her house without pretending otherwise. One of them, a heavy-set man named Bayo Adekunle, sipped his tea slowly and said to the younger man beside him, "The boss does not like being told no." His companion, a nervous man not yet 30, said nothing. He only nodded and kept his eyes on Amara's blue-painted door. That evening, at his home across the city, the branch director, Chukwuma Eze, received a phone call. He recognized the voice before the first sentence had finished, and his stomach twisted itself into a shape he did not know it could make. "The woman is a problem," Kwame said. "Fix the paperwork. Make her name disappear from the records. I do not care how." Chukwuma's hand trembled around the phone. "Sir, there are already signed records. The compliance office has copies." "Then unmake them," Kwame snapped, and the line went dead. Chukwuma sat at his kitchen table long after the call ended, staring at nothing. He had a wife, 2 children in school, a mortgage he was still paying on a house he had scraped for 11 years to afford. And in a locked drawer at the branch, he had a form signed in Amara Okonkwo's careful handwriting. A form that had suddenly stopped feeling like paperwork and had started feeling like a loaded weapon aimed at whoever was holding it. His wife, a schoolteacher named Adeze, found him still sitting there past midnight and asked quietly what was wrong. He told her everything. The bag, the woman, the demand. Adeze listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she asked him the question that would follow him for weeks afterward. "Chukwuma, if you do what he asks, what do you tell our children you do for a living?" He had no answer that satisfied him. He thought of his son, who proudly told classmates that his father worked at a bank and helped people keep their money safe. And he understood, sitting at his own kitchen table at midnight, that safety was not something he could keep pretending to offer if he quietly erased the one honest act that had ever passed through his branch. The next morning, at Amara's small stall in the Eastern Market where she sold tomatoes, onions, and dried fish beside women she had known for years, her closest friend noticed instantly that something was wrong. Her name was Ma Nkechi, older than Amara by perhaps 15 years, sharp-tongued, missing 2 fingers from a factory accident 20 years earlier. She had been a widow twice, raised 4 children, and buried one. And she measured the world the way old traders measured salt, by feel, by weight, by the pinch between finger and thumb. "You look like you saw a ghost walking backwards," Ma Nkechi said, arranging tomatoes into neat red pyramids without looking up. Amara told her everything, in a low voice. The bag, the bank, the man in the charcoal suit, the folder, the offer to lie. Ma Nkechi's hands stopped moving. $30 million, she repeated slowly, as if the number itself was dangerous to say aloud in an open market full of ears. She looked up at Amara. She did not smile. You should have taken the reward, she said finally. Not unkindly, but with the weary logic of a woman who had survived poverty by making peace with small compromises. 150,000 naira is more than either of us has seen in 10 years. Ada's medicine, new shoes, a month without counting. I know what my daughter needs, Amara interrupted, sharper than she meant to. Ma Nkechi was quiet for a long moment, turning a tomato over in her missing-fingered hand without really seeing it. When I was younger than you, she said at last, I worked in a shirt factory that caught fire twice in the same year, because the owners refused to fix wiring they knew was dangerous. The second time, I lost these fingers, pulling a machine off a girl who could not run fast enough. I reported it. Nothing happened. The owner paid someone, and the factory reopened within a month. She set the tomato down. After that, I stopped believing that telling the truth changes anything for people like us. I began to believe it only gets you hurt twice. Once by whoever did the wrong thing, and once by a system too tired or too paid to care. That is why I told you to take the money. Not because I think lying is right, because I have watched honesty lose before, and I did not want to watch it lose again with someone I love. Amara said nothing, because she knew her friend was right, and there was nothing comforting left to say back. That night, back inside the one room behind the tailor shop, Amara boiled water for Ada's tea, while the girl practiced letters on a cracked slate borrowed from school. Mama, Ada said without looking up, the man from yesterday, was he a bad man? Children always knew more than adults ever gave them credit for. Amara knelt beside her. I do not know yet, my love, she answered honestly. But whatever happens, you did nothing wrong, and neither did I. At midnight, a soft scratching sound came from the tin roof. Amara woke instantly. Every muscle tensed. She listened. It is only a cat, she told herself, though she did not fully believe it. She lay in the dark beside her sleeping daughter, staring at the ceiling, replaying the charcoal-suited man's parting words. This is not the end of this conversation. Not even close. 2 days later, Chukwuma arrived at his branch to find 2 men waiting outside his office door. Not employees, not police. Just quiet, patient men in plain clothes who introduced themselves only as associates of Mr. Adeyemi. They asked, very politely, for the key to the locked drawer. Chukwuma's hands trembled as he searched his pockets, buying time he did not know how to use. The documents relating to the recovered funds, one of them said, voice as calm as still water, need to be reviewed for accuracy. Mr. Adeyemi believes there may have been a clerical error regarding the amount. Chukwuma understood immediately what clerical error meant. They wanted him to alter the record, to make $30 million quietly become something smaller, something explainable, something that left no honest woman standing in the way. He thought of his son. He thought of Amara Okonkwo, a stranger he had met for 10 minutes, who had walked into his bank soaking wet and handed him more money than most men see in a lifetime, without hesitation, without asking for anything. He thought about what kind of man he wanted his own children to grow up believing he was. I will need authorization from head office, Chukwuma said slowly, stalling, sweat gathering at his collar despite the air conditioning. The two men exchanged a glance. Mr. Adeyemi was hoping this could stay simple, one said. Chukwuma forced his voice steady. Then Mr. Adeyemi should call head office himself. It was the smallest act of defiance he had ever made in his life, and it terrified him more than anything had in 20 years. That same evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Zenith National Bank. Not one of Kwame's men. A woman named Fatima Bello, an independent auditor sent months earlier by the National Financial Oversight Office to review the branch's compliance records. A routine visit, scheduled long before any of this had happened. Her timing was coincidence. Its consequences would be anything but. Fatima requested to see recent large transaction logs, standard procedure. Chukwuma hesitated only a moment before deciding, silently, that fate had just handed him a door he had not asked for, but very badly needed. He placed the folder containing Amara's signed statement directly into Fatima's hands, along with the full, untouched record of the $30 million. Fatima read through the documents with a furrowed brow. Then she looked up. "This amount," she said. "Was it ever explained where it came from?" Chukwuma shook his head. "The bank only received it. We did not ask where it originated. But I think," he added carefully, choosing each word like a man crossing a river on loose stones, "someone should ask. Soon." Meanwhile, the trouble in Amara's world had begun. Quietly at first, the way rot always begins before anyone notices the smell. 2 mornings later, she arrived at her stall to find every crate overturned, tomatoes crushed into the dirt, her hand-painted sign broken in 2, dried fish scattered across the ground and stepped on. No one had seen who did it. No one, strangely, had seen anything at all. Ma Nkechi helped her gather what could be salvaged, her jaw tight with fury. "This was not thieves," she said, kicking aside a broken crate. "Thieves take things. Whoever did this only wanted to break them." Amara said nothing, because she already understood exactly whose hands had ordered it. That evening, Amara returned home to find her front door slightly ajar. Not broken, not forced, simply left open a crack, as though someone had wanted her to know they had been inside without needing to prove it through damage. Her heart stopped. "Ada!" she screamed, shoving the door open, terror flooding every limb. Her daughter sat exactly where she had left her that morning, unharmed, confused by her mother's panic. "Mama? What is wrong?" Amara checked every corner of the small room. Nothing missing, nothing broken. Only a single folded piece of paper placed neatly on the kitchen table where nothing had been that morning. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. There was no threat written in words, only a photograph, printed, grainy, of herself walking home from the market 3 days earlier, taken from a distance, clearly showing she had been followed and watched without her knowledge. No note, no signature, just the photograph, and the silence that came with it, louder than any words could have been. Amara sat down slowly on the cement floor. The paper trembled in her hands. And for the first time since finding that bag outside the bank, she allowed herself to cry. Not from fear for herself, but from the terrifying realization that doing the right thing had somehow made her family a target. And she had no idea how far this man was willing to go to protect his lie. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window with a kitchen knife across her lap. not because she believed she could fight off men like the ones who worked for Kwame Adeyemi, but because doing nothing felt worse than doing something, even something small and useless. By morning, she had made a decision. She would not run. Running meant leaving behind the stall that fed them, the school that taught Ada, the only life she had ever managed to build. Instead, she walked to the police station near the Eastern Market, with the photograph folded in her pocket, her hands steady now, with the strange calm of a woman who has already imagined the worst outcome, and stopped fearing it. The officer on duty, a tired man named Sergeant Obi Nwosu, listened to her story with visible skepticism until she placed the photograph on the counter. His posture changed instantly. "Someone photographed you without your knowledge and left this inside your locked home?" he asked, already reaching for a report form. Amara nodded. "The man who came to my door said his name was Kwame Adeyemi." Sergeant Nwosu's pen stopped moving. He looked up slowly. "The property developer?" Amara did not know the man's full reputation, only his charcoal suit and cold smile. But Nwosu clearly did. He glanced toward his supervisor's office, then back at her, and lowered his voice. "Madam, you should be very careful who you say that name to around here. Some ears belong to him, even when the mouths do not." Still, he filed the report, though he warned her honestly that it might move slowly, that men with money often moved faster than justice did. Amara thanked him and walked home with the same calm dread she imagined soldiers must feel walking toward a battle they did not choose but could no longer avoid. Across the city, in a very different neighborhood, Fatima Bello, the auditor, was tracing $30 million backward through 3 shell companies. Each one registered to the same address, which turned out to be a small accounting office in a strip mall, staffed by a single overworked clerk named Ruth Ojo, who had no idea her employer's client list included a man building towers across half the city. "I just file what I am told to file," Ruth said, hands trembling slightly as Fatima laid documents across her desk. "I never met any of these companies in person. Everything came through email, through a lawyer." The lawyer's name led Fatima to invoices for construction materials billed at prices no honest supplier would charge, and from there to a name she recognized instantly from the bank's own transfer records: Kwame Adeyemi. Each shell company existed for exactly one purpose, she realized: to make dishonest money look tired and ordinary by the time it reached its final destination. The way water looks the same regardless of which gutter it traveled through to reach the drain. She requested inspection records for Kwame's 4 apartment towers from the Municipal Engineering Office that same afternoon, expecting routine paperwork. What she found instead chilled her far more than the money ever could. Signed safety certifications for foundations that inspection photographs, buried deep inside an unrelated file, showed had never been properly reinforced at all. Buildings meant to hold hundreds of families were rising on foundations built to pass paperwork, not to hold weight. She understood then why $30 million had been moving quietly out of the country. It was not simply a bribe. It was hush money for an inspector who had already seen the cracks and photographed the rebar that was not there. Kwame Adeyemi had not merely broken banking rules. He had gambled hundreds of lives on cheaper concrete. And he had nearly gotten away clean. The trouble in Amara's world grew. Her landlord, a thin, anxious man named Mr. Danjuma, arrived at her door 2 days before rent was due, tapping his clipboard against his palm the way he always did when he had already decided to be unpleasant. I heard about your trouble with a certain businessman, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. I run a respectable property, madam. I cannot have police reports and men in black cars parked outside my building. I have not missed a single payment in 3 years, sir, Amara said quietly, refusing to let her voice shake in front of him. Mr. Danjuma shifted his weight. This is not about payments. It is about risk. If something happens on my property because of who you have upset, I am the one who answers for it. He left without naming a deadline. But the threat sat in the doorway long after he had gone, as real as any photograph left on a table. Amara paid that month's rent in full, in cash, counting it out in front of him so there could be no argument later. Though it left her with almost nothing besides the coins Ma Nkechi had quietly pressed into her hand that same morning, refusing to say where she had found the extra money to spare. The following week, Ada's teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Miss Grace, who Amara had trusted for 2 years, asked to speak with her privately after school. A man came by yesterday, Miss Grace said, glancing nervously toward the door. He asked questions about Ada's attendance, her health records, which days she stays home. He said he was from the school board. Amara, I do not think he was. Amara's blood ran cold. She withdrew Ada from school the very next morning. Not because she wanted to, but because keeping her daughter somewhere Kwame's men could study her routine felt like leaving a door unlocked for wolves. Ada cried at the kitchen table, not understanding why her books had suddenly become forbidden. Just for a little while, my love, Amara promised, though she had no idea how long a little while would need to be, or whether promises like that were even hers to make anymore. She taught Ada letters and numbers at home instead, using chalk on the back of a broken slate, trying to make danger look like an ordinary lesson. Ada adjusted faster than Amara had expected, though not without cost. She stopped asking to play outside after dark without being told to. She began watching the door whenever someone knocked, small shoulders tensing before her mother could even reach the handle. One evening she asked, very quietly, Mama, if something happens to you, who will teach me my letters? Amara held her daughter close and did not let her see how badly the question had landed. Ada began sleeping in her mother's bed most nights instead of her own. Not because she was asked to, but because the girl said the room felt too big and too quiet when danger was something you could no longer see coming. Amara let her stay, understanding that whatever this ordeal was costing the two of them, it was already asking more of a 7-year-old than any child should ever have to give. One evening, walking home later than usual after helping Ma Nkechi salvage what remained of the crushed vegetables, Amara noticed the same dark car from her doorstep visit idling at the corner of her street. Headlights off, engine running low. She stopped walking. The car did not move. For nearly a full minute, woman and vehicle simply watched each other across the empty road. She forced her legs to keep moving, choosing the longer route home through the lit alley behind the tailor's shop instead of the shortcut past the car. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain the men inside could hear it from where they sat. When she finally reached her door and slid the bolt shut, she stood with her back against it for a long time, shaking, before she trusted her hands enough to light the kerosene stove. She did not tell Ada. She did not tell Sergeant Nwosu either. Not yet. Unsure whether idling headlights counted as evidence of anything a tired police station would take seriously. But she began varying her route home each evening after that, sometimes doubling back, sometimes waiting inside a shop until a street cleared, learning the small, exhausting choreography of a woman trying to stay one step ahead of men paid to be patient. Ma Nkechi's stall was vandalized next. Though she had done nothing but sell tomatoes, beside a woman the whole market now whispered about. Her tent slashed open in the night. Her scale, the one she measured every sale with, the one 2 missing fingers had taught her to read by feel, smashed beyond repair. She said nothing to Amara for 2 full days, not wanting to add more weight to a friend already buckling. When Amara finally learned what had happened, she stood outside Ma Nkechi's ruined stall with her fists clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. "This is because of me," she said. Ma Nkechi shook her head firmly. "This is because of him. Do not you dare carry guilt for another man's cruelty. That is exactly what he wants you to do." Sergeant Nwosu, the officer who had first filed Amara's report, was called into his station commander's office the same week. A heavy-set man named Superintendent Musa Ahmed, who rarely bothered closing his door for ordinary conversations, closed it this time. "This Adeyemi case," Ahmed said, not looking up from his desk. "Perhaps it belongs with a different unit, one with more resources for something this large." Nwosu understood the offer for what it was. Not a promotion. A removal, dressed politely. "With respect, sir," he said carefully. "I already have the woman's statement, the photograph, the timeline. Moving it now would only slow things further." Ahmed's jaw tightened. "I am not asking, Sergeant. I am informing you. This has gone above both our heads." That night, Nwosu sat in his own kitchen, much the way Chukwuma once had, staring at nothing. Weighing a career he had built over 11 years against a case file that felt, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, like the first thing he had done in years that had actually mattered. In the morning, he quietly photocopied the entire file before handing the original over. And he mailed the copy to Fatima Bello's office with no note attached. Only his badge number scrawled faintly in the corner. In case anyone ever needed to know exactly who had refused to let a case simply vanish. Ibrahim Yusuf, the inspector who had first uncovered the falsified foundations, received his own warning 2 nights later. Not a photograph, not a broken market stall, but a beating outside his apartment building, delivered by men who never showed their faces and left before neighbors could call for help. He woke in a hospital bed with 2 cracked ribs and a message, whispered by a nurse who had overheard the men leaving. "Tell your friends. This is only the beginning." A journalist named Chidinma Achebe arrived at his bedside within hours, notebook in hand, horrified but undeterred. She had been chasing rumors about Adeyemi construction for 6 months, and until now had been unable to pin down a single sourced fact. "I can still talk," Ibrahim said through gritted teeth. "And I am going to. If they wanted me silent, they should have hit harder." Chidinma recorded every word, though her own hands shook as she wrote, aware now that this story had teeth sharper than any she had ever chased before. At home, in his marble-floored mansion, Kwame's wife, Nneka, a quiet woman who had learned years earlier not to ask too many questions about her husband's business, finally asked one anyway after noticing armed guards stationed outside their own gate for the first time in their marriage. "Why do we suddenly need men with guns outside our house?" she asked, over dinner neither of them touched. "Because the world is full of people who want to take what I have built," Kwame snapped, harder than he had intended. Nneka set down her fork and did not pick it up again that evening. Their son Toby, 12 years old and already sensing more than he understood, asked his father the next morning whether the news reports about cracked buildings were about them. Kwame told him no, and hated, for the first time in years, how easily the lie came. He began sleeping poorly, replaying the moment on Amara's doorstep again and again, wondering if a softer approach, a larger offer, a different tone might have bought her signature instead of her refusal. He never once, in all those sleepless nights, wondered whether the towers themselves should simply have been built properly in the first place. Bayo Adekunle, the heavy-set man who had first watched Amara's house from the tea stall, had not been among those who beat Ibrahim. But he had driven the car that dropped the men nearby and picked them up after. He said nothing about it to his wife that night, though she noticed he did not eat, did not sleep, and stared for a long time at their own sleeping son before finally turning off the light. He had worked for Kwame for 6 years, driving, watching, delivering envelopes he never opened, telling himself the same story every such man tells himself when the money is good and the questions are dangerous. It is not my business what is inside. But an inspector's cracked ribs were harder to explain away than an envelope, and Bayo found the story no longer fit as comfortably as it once had. When Kwame called him the next morning, demanding the men handle Amara more permanently now that the police report existed, Bayo said nothing for a long moment. "Sir," he said finally, choosing his words with unusual care, "there is already a report with your name attached to hers. If something happens to her now, it points straight back to you. I have kept quiet about a lot over the years. I will not keep quiet about that." Kwame hung up without answering, and Bayo sat in his car outside her darkened window that night longer than his employer would have wanted, turning the question over in his own mind for the first time in 6 years of simply following instructions. 3 nights later, an anonymous envelope arrived at Fatima Bello's office, containing photographs of the 2 men who had visited Ibrahim, along with a handwritten note listing the address where Kwame kept a second set of ledgers, the ones that never appeared in any official audit. There was no signature, only a single line at the bottom. "Some of us built things here too. We did not build them to fall on children." Kwame's lawyer visited Chidinma's newspaper office the next morning. Calm, expensively dressed, carrying a letter threatening a defamation lawsuit that could bankrupt her small publication before a single word was printed. "My client has done nothing but build homes for this city," the lawyer said smoothly. "Careless reporting could destroy livelihoods, yours included." Chidinma's editor, a cautious man named Mr. Okafor, nearing retirement, wanted to shelve the story entirely rather than risk the paper's survival. "We have no proof strong enough yet to survive a courtroom," he told her, not unkindly. "Rumors and one woman's bruised ribs will not be enough against a man with Adeyemi's lawyers." Chidinma argued late into the night, but she left the office without a promise either way. For nearly a week, the story sat unpublished in a drafts folder, while Mr. Okafor consulted the paper's own lawyer, a cautious woman who confirmed his fears. Without documentary proof tying Kwame directly to the falsified certifications, printing the accusation risked a lawsuit that could close the paper's doors for good, ending not just this story, but every story the small publication might ever tell afterward. Chidinma understood the risk. She simply could not make herself accept it as the final answer. She spent those days building her case quietly, on her own time, interviewing residents of Tower 2 who described strange sounds at night, tracking down a former site worker who confirmed, off the record, what would later be said under oath. She brought each new piece to Mr. Okafor, one at a time, watching his resistance soften by degrees. The way stone softens under patient water, rather than sudden force. It was Fatima's audit findings, arriving at last with municipal engineering records attached, that finally gave Mr. Okafor what he needed. Not rumor, not a bruised inspector's word alone, but government paperwork confirming falsified certifications across all 4 towers. He read the documents twice, in silence, then looked up at Chidinma with something between relief and dread. "Print it," he said quietly. "But print it exactly as it happened. Nothing more, nothing less. We only get one chance to be believed." Amara, meanwhile, had reached the end of what her savings could carry. The stall's damaged stock, the missing school fees she no longer needed but had already paid in advance, the rent looming closer each day. All of it converged into a single, impossible number. She sat with Ma and Kechi one evening, staring at coins spread across a table that would not multiply no matter how long she looked at them. Bayo himself approached Amara directly for the first time the following morning, waiting near her rebuilt stall until the surrounding vendors had briefly stepped away. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You could still fix this," he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. "One phone call, one signature withdrawn. Everyone goes back to their lives." Amara kept her hands steady on the scale, weighing tomatoes for a customer who had no idea what was happening beside her. "Whose life goes back to normal?" she asked, without looking at him. "Mine? Or the family sleeping under those towers tonight?" Bayo's jaw tightened. "That is not your problem to solve. You found a bag. You could have just kept walking." "But I did not," Amara said, finally meeting his eyes, her voice low but unshaking. "And neither will I now." Bayo studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his expression. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Ma and Kechi hurried over the instant he had gone. What did he want? "The same thing he always wants," Amara said. "For me to become someone else." "There is still time to take his money," Ma and Kechi said gently. Not as an accusation this time, but as a frightened friend grasping for any door left open. "No one would blame you. You have already suffered enough for one signature you never even wanted to give." Amara closed her eyes, and for the first time since refusing Kwame on her doorstep, she let herself seriously imagine saying yes. She imagined Ada healthy, fed, safe, in a real house far from broken market stalls and photographs left on kitchen tables. She imagined the fear simply stopping all at once, the way rain stops when clouds finally empty themselves. For nearly a full minute, sitting in the dark with her daughter asleep nearby, Amara nearly walked back to that charcoal-suited man's office to accept everything she had once refused. What Amara did not know that night was that word of her troubles had spread quietly through the market in the days before, from stall to stall, the way news of both cruelty and courage always found its way through women who spent their days shoulder to shoulder selling vegetables and gossip in equal measure. Without telling her, a dozen of them had begun setting aside small amounts from their own thin earnings. Ma and Kechi had organized it without calling it anything so grand as a collection, simply telling each vendor, "Amara needs a little help this month, and next month it could be any of us." Coins and small notes passed hand to hand, wrapped in a headscarf, until the bundle Ma Nikichi pressed into Amara's palm that morning was heavier than either of them let on. "Do not ask where it came from," Ma Nikichi had said. "Just let it help." It was this same quiet network of women, more than any single dramatic act, that had kept Amara's family fed through the worst of the harassment, reminding her in small, daily ways that the cruelty of one powerful man had not managed to isolate her from the community that had known her for years. Then Ada coughed in her sleep. The same soft, small sound that had first made Amara reach for that bag outside the bank. And she understood, with sudden clarity, that the very love pushing her towards surrender was the same love that had made her honest in the first place. If she lied now, she would not be protecting that love. She would be selling it. She did not go to Kwame's office. Instead, she went to Chukwuma at the bank, the only man in this whole mess who had ever looked at her with something like guilt instead of hunger. "I need the reward," she said plainly. "Not favors, not silence. What was promised to me legally, whenever it comes, however small it still is." Chukwuma looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his desk and withdrew an envelope he had been quietly preparing for days, uncertain whether he would ever have the courage to hand it over. "It is not much yet," he admitted. "Only a partial advance. The board approved before everything grew complicated. But it is clean money, and it is yours." It was not enough to erase her debts, but it was enough to buy another week. And in the arithmetic of survival Amara had learned so well, another week was sometimes the entire difference between drowning and staying afloat. She thanked him with a nod, too tired for words, and walked home, clutching the envelope like something alive. 3 nights later, disaster struck one of Kwame's occupied towers before any court could intervene. A section of the parking structure beneath Tower 2 buckled during ordinary rainfall. Nothing catastrophic, no lives lost, but loud enough to wake every resident, public enough that no bribe could quiet the cracking concrete filmed by a dozen phones from the street below. The videos spread within hours, faster than any newspaper article could have managed alone. Suddenly, the story was not rumor anymore. It was footage, shaking, grainy, of a building trembling exactly the way Ibrahim had warned it would. Chidinma's editor called her before sunrise. "Print it. Print everything. We cannot be the only paper standing on the sidelines now." Fatima's audit findings, quietly compiled over weeks, arrived at the municipal engineering office the same morning. No longer a suspicion, but a documented pattern. Falsified certifications across 4 towers, timestamps matching the exact dates Kwame's bribery attempt had unraveled. What had been circumstantial suddenly became undeniable, stitched together by an auditor's patience and a woman's stubborn refusal to lie. Kwame watched the parking structure footage loop endlessly on every news channel from his office window, understanding for the first time that this was no longer a problem he could threaten his way out of. "Get me on a plane," he told his lawyer, voice low and fast. "Anywhere. Tonight." His lawyer's silence told him everything before the words came. "Sir," the lawyer said finally, "your accounts have already been frozen. I do not think there is anywhere left to run tonight." Chidinma published her full article the next morning, no longer hiding behind vague language, naming Kwame Adeyemi directly, detailing the falsified inspections, the bribery attempt, and the honest woman who had refused every incentive to help bury the truth. Within hours, government inspectors arrived at all 4 tower sites, ordering immediate evacuation of the 2 buildings already occupied. Families streamed out into the street, confused, frightened, carrying children and mattresses, staring up at buildings they had trusted with their lives, buildings that might have collapsed on them without warning during the next heavy rain. Among them was a young mother named Blessing Adewale, with twin daughters, clutching one child on each hip while a neighbor carried their mattress behind her. All three of them still in night clothes, though the sun had long since risen. "We paid a full year's rent in advance," Blessing told the reporters gathered outside, her voice shaking with a mixture of relief and fury. "We trusted the building because it had Adeyemi's name on the sign out front. His name was supposed to mean something." She did not yet know that a woman across the city, one she would never meet in person for another 2 months, had refused a bribe that had helped set this exact morning of evacuation into motion. Amara watched the footage on Ma Nkechi's small television, hand pressed over her mouth, understanding at last the full size of what her single signature had prevented. That evening, police arrived at Kwame's office. Led by Sergeant Nwosu, the same tired officer who had filed Amara's report weeks earlier. His request to stay on the case had finally been honored after Superintendent Ahmed's own superiors reviewed the file Nwosu had refused to let vanish. Kwame stood when they entered, straightening his jacket out of pure reflex, as though composure alone might still rescue him. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, the same smooth voice he had once used on Amara's doorstep, though it cracked slightly this time, around the edges. Zainab, still packing her desk 2 offices away, heard the commotion and stepped into the hallway just in time to see her employer of 3 years led out in handcuffs past rows of silent staff who had stopped typing to watch. "You should be careful who you underestimate," Nwosu said quietly as he read Kwame his rights, thinking privately of the woman who had started this entire unraveling with nothing but a signature and a refusal to lie. Kwame said nothing more, though his eyes found Zainab's for one brief second in the hallway, and whatever passed between them, she would later say, looked less like anger than a man finally seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. Amara learned of the arrest the next morning from Ma Nkechi at the market, who came running between the tomato stalls, waving a newspaper with tears in her eyes. "You did this," Ma Nkechi said, breathless. "You started this." Amara took the paper slowly, staring at Kwame's photograph beside headlines about collapsed foundations and frozen accounts. And she felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not triumph, but a heavy, aching relief. If this story has moved you even slightly, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which country you are tuning in from today. I promise to read through every single one before this week ends. Now, let us continue. Weeks passed. Kwame Adeyemi's trial began quietly, but grew louder as details emerged. Falsified safety records, bribery attempts, evidence tampering, and the deliberate endangerment of families who had trusted his name on a building's foundation. Ibrahim Yusuf testified with the confidence of a man who had spent months living in fear before finally choosing not to anymore. His healed ribs, a quiet reminder of what silence had already cost him. The state's prosecutor, a methodical woman named Aisha Bello, opened the trial by reminding the court that this case was not simply about missing money or falsified paperwork. "This is about a man who built homes for strangers," she said, and decided again and again that their safety was a cost he could afford to skip. "The only reason we are not mourning a collapsed building full of families is a single woman's refusal to help him hide that choice." Superintendent Ahmed, watching from the back of the courtroom gallery, caught Sergeant Nwosu's eye during a recess and gave a short, stiff nod. The closest thing to an apology either man's pride would allow. "The file stayed open," Ahmed said simply when Nwosu approached him afterward. "That is what mattered in the end." Nwosu accepted the acknowledgement without gloating, though he permitted himself walking home that evening, a small and private satisfaction he had earned the hard way. A site foreman named Kelechi Ume testified next, a broad-shouldered man who had personally poured concrete for Tower 2 and who had raised concerns twice with his supervisors about reinforcement bars arriving thinner than the blueprint specified. Both times, he had been told the specifications had been updated and to simply follow instructions or find work elsewhere. "I have 4 children," he told the court quietly. "I needed the job more than I needed to argue with paper I could not prove was wrong." Kwame's defense lawyer pressed Kelechi hard, suggesting he was simply a disgruntled worker looking to blame his employer for his own mistakes on site. Kelechi did not raise his voice. "I know concrete," he said simply. "I have worked with it since I was 16. What went into those foundations would not have held a garden wall, let alone 4 floors of families." The courtroom was silent for a long moment afterward. Blessing Adewale, the young mother who had lived on the 3rd floor of Tower 2 with her twin daughters until the evacuation, testified about the night the parking structure cracked, describing the sound that had woken her. "Not an explosion," she said, "but a long, low groan, like something enormous trying to hold itself together and failing. I have nowhere else to live now, but at least my daughters are alive to have nowhere to live." Zainab Musa testified last among the witnesses called before Amara, describing the ledgers she had quietly copied in her final week before resigning, evidence she had handed to Fatima Bello without ever being asked, driven by a guilt she said she would carry regardless of what the court decided. "I filed his paperwork for 3 years," she said. "I told myself filing was not the same as knowing. I do not believe that anymore." The decision to copy those ledgers had not come easily to Zainab. She had sat with the files open on her computer screen for 3 nights before finally transferring them, terrified of losing her job, more terrified of a prison sentence for interference, most terrified of all that she might be wrong about what she thought she had found. It was the image of Blessing's twin daughters, seen briefly on the news, carrying their mattress into the street, that had finally settled it for her. "I kept telling myself it was not my responsibility," she admitted to Fatima when she finally handed the files over. "But filing the paperwork that let it happen made it my responsibility too, whether I wanted that or not." Fatima had said nothing in response, except to thank her, understanding that some confessions need only to be heard, not answered. Amara was called to testify as well, describing simply and honestly what had happened outside the bank. The visit from the man in the charcoal suit, the photograph left on her kitchen table. Kwame's defense lawyer tried, gently at first, and then with increasing pressure, to suggest she had exaggerated the threat, that a photograph proved nothing, that fear could make anyone imagine danger where none existed. "I did not imagine the crushed tomatoes at my market stall," Amara said evenly. "I did not imagine withdrawing my daughter from school because a stranger asked her teacher about her attendance. I did not imagine a car with no headlights waiting outside my street at night." The lawyer had no response prepared, for an answer delivered without a single raised word. She did not exaggerate. She did not perform grief or anger for the courtroom. She told the truth plainly, the same way she had lived her entire life, and somehow that plainness carried more weight than any dramatic speech could have. When asked directly why she had not simply signed the paper and kept the 150,000 naira, she answered, without pausing to consider the question, as though she had already answered it to herself many times over. "Because it was never mine to lie about. The money was never mine either. only the choice was. The courtroom was quiet for a very long time after that. Kwame Adeyemi was sentenced to 15 years for fraud, endangerment, and attempted bribery of a public official. Though many in the courtroom whispered that the sentence felt too light for buildings that had nearly collapsed on sleeping families. Zainab Musa resigned the same week the verdict was read, unable to reconcile what she had learned about the man she had worked for with the polished image he had always presented to the world. Chukwuma Eze kept his position at the bank, though he requested a transfer to a smaller branch afterward, saying quietly to his wife one evening that he needed distance from a building where he had once nearly agreed to erase an honest woman's name from history to protect a dishonest man's fortune. Adeze, his wife, framed a small newspaper clipping of the verdict and hung it quietly in their kitchen. Not to celebrate a stranger's downfall, she told her husband, but as a reminder to their own children of the night their father had chosen honesty over convenience at his own kitchen table. Chukwuma found the clipping slightly embarrassing, though he never once asked her to take it down. Fatima Bello received a formal commendation from her office, though she told colleagues privately that the credit belonged elsewhere. To a woman who had walked into a bank soaking wet with $30 million she could have kept, and chosen instead to hand it over without a second thought. Fatima had spent 11 years auditing branches that mostly turned up nothing more dramatic than minor clerical errors. She admitted to her own husband that she had nearly requested a transfer out of compliance work entirely the year before this case landed on her desk. Tired of feeling like her job changed nothing. "This is the first time in years I felt like the paperwork actually mattered," she told him one evening, the commendation letters still unopened on the counter beside her. "Not because of me, because somewhere at the start of all this tangled mess of shell companies and false certificates, there was one honest signature that made the rest of it worth untangling." She kept a photocopy of Amara's original statement in her desk long after the case closed. A small reminder on slower days of why the tedious work still mattered. Ibrahim Yusuf returned to inspection work 6 weeks after his ribs healed. Though he requested reassignment to a different district, one further from the towers that still haunted his sleep some nights, he kept the hospital discharge papers folded inside his desk drawer afterward. Not as a trophy, he told colleagues, but as a reminder of exactly what silence would have cost him if he had chosen it instead. Chidinma Achebe's article won a regional press award the following year, though she said in her acceptance speech that the true credit belonged to a woman who had never once sought a headline. Only a night's sleep free of fear for her daughter. Mr. Okafor, the editor, retired soon after, telling Chidinma before he left that hers had been the story that reminded him why he had become a journalist in the first place. Decades earlier, before caution had quietly become his default setting. 6 months later, Amara stood in a small house of her own, purchased with part of her reward, watching movers carry in a second-hand couch while Ada ran excitedly between the empty rooms. Her cough now only a memory from a season she barely remembered. The one room behind the tailor shop belonged to someone else's story now. She had not spent the reward carelessly. A portion went toward the house, modest but solid, with a roof she had personally asked a contractor to inspect twice before signing anything, unwilling ever again to trust a building simply because someone told her it was safe. Another portion she set aside, untouched, for Ada's schooling, and a smaller amount she quietly returned to Ma Nkechi and the other market women who had once pulled coins into a headscarf without ever expecting repayment. "You did not have to do that," Ma Nkechi said, staring at the folded notes Amara pressed into her hand. "I know," Amara answered. "But you taught me something important without meaning to. Kindness that expects nothing back is still worth paying forward when you finally can." Ma Nkechi, who rarely allowed herself to be moved in front of others, turned quickly back to her tomatoes so Amara would not see her eyes. Mr. Danjuma, her old landlord, appeared once more before she moved, standing awkwardly at her door with none of his earlier clipboard bravado. "I heard what really happened," he said, turning his hat over in his hands. "I should not have threatened to put you out over another man's cruelty. I judged you for the danger, madam, instead of the courage that caused it." Amara accepted the apology plainly, without warmth, but without bitterness either, understanding that some people only find their better instincts after the danger has already passed. In the prison where Kwame Adeyemi now spent his evenings, in a cell far smaller than any room in the towers he had built, he was permitted 1 hour of television each week. He watched, without comment, a segment about the government compensation fund helping families rehouse themselves after the evacuation. And for reasons he could not fully explain, even to himself, he thought not of his lost fortune, nor his ruined name, but of a doorstep, a folder, and a woman who had simply said no. Ma Nkechi visited often, still selling tomatoes at the market, still sharp-tongued, though she had softened considerably toward the friend she had once warned against honesty's dangerous price. "You proved me wrong," Ma Nkechi admitted one afternoon, sipping tea on Amara's new porch. "I thought honesty like yours only existed in stories told to children before bed." Amara smiled, but she did not answer right away. She thought about words a shopkeeper had said to her once, months earlier, words that had lingered longer than she wanted to admit. That her honesty had been rewarded through a combination of courage and luck, not guaranteed by some universal law that always protects the truthful. She had thought about those words many nights since. "I did not do it because I expected a reward," Amara said finally. "I did it because keeping that money would have meant living every day afterward, knowing exactly what kind of person I had become. I could not have looked at Ada the same way again, knowing I chose money over what was right, even if no one else on earth had ever found out." Ma Nkechi nodded slowly, understanding settling over her weathered face. "But it could have gone differently," she said quietly, echoing what neither of them had said aloud before. "If that parking structure had not cracked when it did, if that journalist's editor had not finally agreed to print, you could have returned that money and simply disappeared into whatever those men decided to do with you." "I know," Amara said simply, "and I have made peace with that. Doing the right thing was never a guarantee that everything would turn out fine. It was only ever a guarantee that I could live with myself, whatever happened next. That was the only certainty honesty ever really offered me." That night, after Ma Nkechi had gone home and Ada had fallen asleep in a real bedroom for the first time in her life, Amara sat alone on her new porch, looking out at a street quieter than the one she had left behind. She thought of the 11 seconds she had stood over that bag outside the bank, and how differently everything might have unfolded had she simply kept walking. She would never know. And some nights, that not knowing felt heavier than anything else in the whole story. Honesty had not saved her because the universe rewards good people. It had saved her because a tired auditor happened to visit that week, because a bruised inspector refused to stay silent, because a driver with a family of his own decided an envelope of photographs mattered more than his loyalty, because a struggling newspaper decided, at the last possible moment, that the truth was worth the risk of ruin. A year later, the families evacuated from Kwame's towers received compensation from a government fund established after his conviction. Though Blessing Adewale told a reporter she still flinched every time she heard concrete being poured on a construction site nearby. Kelechi Ume, the foreman, found work with a different company, one that let him inspect the bars himself before they went into the ground, something he said he would never again take for granted. Bayo Adekunle was never charged. There had been no evidence tying the anonymous envelope to him, and he had not been present the night Ibrahim was beaten. He quietly changed jobs, driving delivery trucks instead, and told his wife only once, years later, that he still thought about the inspector's cracked ribs sometimes, and hoped the note he had sent had counted for something, in whatever ledger truly mattered. Ada grew taller and stronger in her new home, her cough long gone. Though she remembered in fragments a photograph on a kitchen table, and a night her mother would not explain. When she was older, she would ask her mother for the full story, and Amara would tell it to her plainly, the same way she told everything, without decoration, without pretending the outcome had ever been certain. "Would you do it again, Mama?" Ada asked one evening, years later, already taller than her mother by then. Amara considered the question longer than her daughter expected. "Yes," she said finally. "Not because I knew it would work out. I did not know that. I would do it again because the alternative was becoming someone I could not live inside of anymore. That part was never a gamble. That part I was always sure of." Perhaps that was the real lesson, the one no proverb could soften into something comfortable. Doing right does not promise safety. It only promises that whatever comes, ruin or rescue, chaos or quiet, you will meet it as yourself, and not as someone you had to become in order to survive. There is a question worth sitting with long after this story ends, one Amara herself never fully answered. Even in her own mind, how many honest choices, made quietly, by ordinary people, in ordinary rooms, never make it into any newspaper at all? Not because they did not matter, but simply because the auditor was late that week, or the journalist's editor said no, or the photograph was never taken. Amara's honesty was rewarded. It is worth remembering that reward was never the reason she chose it, and it is not guaranteed for everyone who chooses the same. Amara closed her eyes that first night in her new home, and for the first time in months, she slept without listening for footsteps on the roof. If this story stayed with you, that is exactly why I make them. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Hit like if Amara's choice moved you the way it moved me telling it. And share this with one person who needs a reminder that doing right is still worth it, even when it is hard. See you in the next story.